All right, so this is part 2 of section 6.1. And in part 2, we're focused on factoring by grouping. So grouping means putting things together that have something in common. Now, in this first example, the questions have already been grouped together and common factors were already taken out. So now we're factoring just like with GCF, okay, with greatest common factor. So if I were to take this and kind of split it in half and look at each piece separately, I should notice that both pieces have a common factor, which is 7x minus 1. Once I remove that common factor, whatever I'm left with is going to go into a second set of parentheses. So when I take out 7x minus 1, I'm left with 5 squared minus 3. And this right here is your solution to factoring this case. Now if I look at the next one, same kind of idea, split it in the middle and look at both pieces. I should notice that these two parentheses are exactly the same. So that becomes my common factor and I take it out. When I take that out, what am I left with? So I'm left with 2x, and there's got to be something over here for this second one. And I happen to remember that it has an imaginary 1 sitting in front of it. So this is going to get a 1, and I close my parentheses, and this is my answer here. Now when I look at C, excuse me, I notice something a little bit different. I notice that these two parentheses have similar components, but they're not exactly the same. So in class today, some people said, well, the second one, this one over here is in the wrong order. So even if I change its order, there's still something wrong. It doesn't quite match the first one, and I need it to match in order for it to be the common factor. So the difference is this second one, if I take out a negative 1, then negative y divided by negative 1 is y. 3 divided by negative 1 is negative 3. So now that I've taken out that negative 1, these two parentheses look identical. So I'm going to rewrite my problem. I have 3y squared times y minus 3 plus 4 times negative 1 times y minus 3. So of course I know that 4 times negative 1 is really a negative 4 times y minus 3, and I still have my 3y squared times y minus 3. These two parentheses are my common factor, and I'm left with 3y squared minus 4 once I take out that common factor. Now, when we work with grouping, really we need to do the grouping on our own. So we're grouping the first two terms and the last two terms. And so we could almost think of it as like a 2 by 2. We're grouping two things and two things. Once I've created my two groups, I'm going to factor out their common factor, whatever each group has individually in common. Then I'm going to write the parentheses that they have in common, and in the second parentheses, write whatever's left over. Once I get, excuse me, to step 4 is basically what we were doing up here in A, B, and C. Okay? Now, we said our very first step is going to be to group, and we said use the idea of like a 2 by 2. So if I group my first two and my last two, now I'm going to look at each of these individually like if they were a GCF problem, a greatest common factor problem. So if I look at x to the third plus 2x squared, the GCF here is my x squared. That's the most that they both have in common. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to factor that out. X squared times what value gives me back x to the third? So that's x squared times x. And then, of course, x squared times 2 gives me my 2x squared. Now, if I take a look at my second parentheses, my second grouping, I have x plus 2. The greatest common factor for x plus 2 is just a 1. I'm going to take out that 1 in this case, and I'm going to rewrite my group as x plus 2, because 1 times x is my x that I started with, and 1 times 2 is 2. Now this is just like example 4 we were working on. I have two parentheses that are identical, and once I remove those parentheses, my second parentheses gets whatever's left over. So this would be my factoring completed. Okay, we're going to skip B for a second. We'll come back to this one because that's probably the most challenging one on this set of questions. So we'll come back in just a second. If I look at C, again, group 2 by 2. So first two, last two. Focusing on my first group of two, their greatest common factor is a b squared. So when I take out b squared times what is going to give me 4b to the third. So that's going to be a 4b. And b squared times what gives me b squared. So I know I need a 1. If I look at my second two, their GCF is a 2. So I'm going to take that 2 out. If I take the 2 out, 2 times what is going to give me 8b. So that needs to be a 4b. And 2 times what gives me 2. So that would be a 1. Now I should notice these two parentheses are identical. If they're not, you need to go back and check your work because something's wrong. So 4b plus 1, got rid of those 2. And then I'm left with b squared plus 2. All right, we'll do D, and then, like I said, go back to B. So group 2 by 2, 2 and 2. I look at my first two. What's their greatest common factor? Okay, well, I know that 12 and 20 are both divisible by 4. 4 is going to be the biggest number that divides 12 and 20. And I know that they both have 2 r's, so that's an r squared. All right, so 4r squared times what is going to give me 12r to the third? So I know that 4 times 3 is 12, and I had 3 r's, and I put 2 outside, excuse me, so there are 2 left, plus 4 times what number gives me 20, so that's a 5. There were 2 r's, and I pulled them both outside, so there are no more r's left. When I look at my second two, the biggest number that will divide 15 and 25 is 5. And since 25 doesn't have an r, r is not part of the greatest common factor. So I'm going to take out the 5. 5 times what number gives me 15? So that would be 5 times 3. The r is still inside. Plus 5 times 5 gives me 25. Again, these two parentheses should be exactly the same. So that's 3r plus 5. And 4r squared plus 5. All right, and now we'll go to the most challenging one, B. So I'm still going to group my first two and my last two. So these first two are both divisible by 3, and they both have an x in common. So I'm going to take that 3 and x, and I'm going to pull it to the outside. So 3x times x gives me 3x squared, and 3x times 4 gives me negative 12x. Now, I know that I want these parentheses to look exactly the same. So in order to do that, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to need to make sure that I take this negative sign and I pull it to the outside. So I'm going to need a negative 5 so that I distribute back in, and this becomes negative 5x plus 20. And also these parentheses match. Okay? So my greatest common factor, my common factor becomes that x minus 4. And what's left over when I remove that? 3x minus 5. All right, and this is the second part. If you have any questions, you can, of course, come and see me before or after school, and I'd be happy to help you with it.